What comes to your mind when you think of the atrocities committed during World War II? The horrors of the Holocaust and the concentration camps set up by the Nazis, right? One such camp was Dachau, the first regular concentration camp built by the Nazi government. But what was the fate of these Nazi guards who committed these horrific crimes against humanity? In this video, we will explore the fate of the Nazi guards of Dachau and how justice was served. So, buckle up, because this is a story you wouldn't want to miss. On April 29, 1945, just 1 week prior to the end of World War II in Europe, the U.S. 7th Army 45 Infantry Division liberated Dachau, the first regular concentration camp built by the Nazi government. The sight that awaited the soldiers was harrowing, as they were greeted by the stench of human excrement and decaying bodies. Many soldiers were brought to tears or vomited upon finding piles of severely malnourished corpses and 30 railroad cars filled with thousands of dead bodies. The survivors, numbering over 30,000, were emaciated and appeared to be nothing more than walking skeletons. Sadly, thousands of these survivors would later succumb to typhus epidemics and starvation in the months following the camp's liberation. The soldiers and prisoners alike were outraged by the atrocities that had taken place in the camp and desired revenge against their Nazi tormentors. The concentration camp system was initially established by the National Socialists to incarcerate and intimidate leaders of political, social, and cultural movements that the Nazis deemed to be a threat to the regime. Dachau, located near Munich and established in March 1933, became the first concentration camp. Its purpose was to instill fear through brutal treatment and terror exerted by the SS. Theodor Eicke, Dachau's commandant, introduced a system of regulations in October 1933 that inflicted harsh punishment on prisoners for minor offenses. He also ensured that Dachau served as a model for all later concentration camps and became a training center, or school of violence, for SS guards who would be deployed throughout the concentration camp system. Initially, the internees were primarily German communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and other political opponents of the Nazi regime, and the camp had a capacity of 5,000 prisoners during its first year. Dachau was initially established as a concentration camp for political prisoners in 1933 and evolved over time to include various groups targeted by the Nazi regime. Along with political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma and Sinti people, homosexuals, repeat criminal offenders, and asocials were interned there. Jews were also sent to Dachau, albeit in relatively small numbers during the early years, usually because they belonged to one of the aforementioned groups or had violated Nazi race laws. The SS began constructing a large complex of buildings at Dachau in early 1937, with prisoners forced to work under terrible conditions. Completed in mid-August 1938, the camp remained largely unchanged until the end of the war in 1945. The persecution of Jews led to an increase in their numbers at Dachau, with almost 11,000 Jewish men interned there after the Kristallnacht program on November 1938. Most were released after a few weeks or months, provided they had made arrangements to leave Germany. The camp was divided into two sections, the camp area and the crematorium area. The former consisted of 32 barracks, including one for clergy and one for medical experiments, as well as support buildings and a prison block known as the bunker. Detention in the bunker allowed the SS to isolate and punish rebellious prisoners outside the reach of their fellow inmates. The courtyard between prison and central kitchen was used for summary executions, while the camp was surrounded by an electrified fence, a ditch, and a wall with guard towers. The outbreak of the Second World War on September 1, 1939 had severe consequences for the inmates at the Dachau concentration camp. Their living conditions deteriorated significantly as a result of brutal working conditions, insufficient food, and poor hygiene facilities, which led to an alarming increase in the death rate. In 1940, the German military began transporting prisoners to Dachau from countries they had occupied. In 1942, a crematorium area was built close to the main camp. This area consisted of an older crematorium and a newer crematorium that included a gas chamber. Both of these structures were constructed in 1942. However, there is no evidence that can be considered reliable to suggest that the gas chamber was utilized in the execution of people. Instead, the inmates were put through a process of selection in which those who were deemed to be too sick or weak were sent to a euthanasia center in Austria called Harthium. There, more than 2,500 Dachau inmates were murdered in gas chambers. In addition, mass shootings took place in the bunker courtyard as well as on an SS-designed shooting range, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Dachau prisoners, including at least 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war. Beginning in the year 1942, German physicians began subjecting prisoners to a variety of medical tests and experiments. These included high altitude and hypothermia tests, as well as a seawater desalination and pharmaceutical trials. As a direct consequence of these experiments, hundreds of inmates either passed away or were left permanently disabled. In addition, prisoners at Dachau were used as forced laborers in the maintenance of the camp, as well as in various construction projects and small-scale handicraft industries. Under appalling conditions, they dug roads, toiled in gravel pits, and drained marshes in order to support themselves. During the war, the forced labor of prisoners held in concentration camps became an essential component in German armaments production. During the summer and fall of 1944, satellite camps were set up in close proximity to armaments factories across the southern region of Germany. Only Dachau had around 140 subcamps, the majority of which were located in southern Bavaria. The prisoners in these subcamps were forced to work almost exclusively in armaments work, which led to the deaths of thousands of inmates. During World War II, when the Allied forces were drawing closer to Germany, the Germans began to move prisoners from concentration camps near the front in order to prevent the capture of the camps and the prisoners who were held within them. As a direct consequence of this, the living conditions at Dachau concentration camp deteriorated to an alarming degree, as more prisoners were transferred there from other concentration camps. The camp, which had been designed to hold a maximum of 200 inmates when it was first established, eventually became home to more than 1,600 inmates, leading to overcrowding and deplorable sanitary conditions. After being transported for days, prisoners arrived at the camp with little to no food or water, and many of them were on their deathbeds. A typhus epidemic that killed between 100 and 200 prisoners every day was caused by a number of factors, including overcrowding, poor sanitation, a lack of provisions, and already weakened inmates. The last 6 months of the war claimed the lives of more than one-third of the 41,500 people who died in the Dachau concentration camp between 1933 and 1945. In April of 1945, as the end of the war drew near, the SS began evacuating prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp in order to prevent the prisoners from being freed by Allied troops. At least 25,000 prisoners from the Dachau camp system were made to endure arduous foot marches or were transported away in freight trains. As a direct consequence of these actions, several thousand Dachau prisoners perished as a result of starvation, hypothermia, or exhaustion. The main Dachau concentration camp was freed by the 45th Infantry Division of the United States Army on April 29, 1945. The remaining SS and Nazi guards put up a fight against the American soldiers trying to enter the camp, but in the end, the Americans were able to overcome the resistance and enter the camp. As the soldiers discovered more than 30 railroad cars full of decomposing bodies and numerous dead bodies lying where they had fallen before the camp's liberation, they were overcome by the stench of death. The atrocities that the soldiers saw left them traumatized and shocked, and many of them came to the realization that they were not merely fighting against an adversary, but against evil itself. The ordeal that the soldiers went through at the Dachau concentration camp left an indelible mark on their lives and changed the way they viewed the world. They were exposed to the inhumanity and cruelty of the Nazi regime firsthand, and as a result their lives were irrevocably altered by the atrocities they saw. It was a harrowing ordeal for everyone involved when, in April of 1945, American soldiers liberated the Dachau concentration camp. The sight of malnourished prisoners, many of whom had been subjected to abuse and torture for years at a time, left an indelible mark on the minds of the soldiers who were responsible for their liberation. While some of the soldiers were overcome with emotion, others were filled with rage and hatred towards the German SS guards. All of the soldiers shared a common target: the Germans. As we conclude this video, it's clear that the atrocities committed at the Dachau concentration camp were horrific and inhumane. The liberation of the camp by the U.S. 7th Army 45th Infantry Division marked a turning point in the fight against the Nazi regime and its cruel policies. If you found this video informative, please consider sharing it with others and subscribing to our channel for more thought-provoking content.